Today we've got your full in-depth review of the Tamron 50-300 F4.5-6.3. This is going to be a full-frame telephoto zoom lens, currently for Sony E-mount lenses, but may also be available for your mount when you're watching this video. So guys, this is a fantastic little travel-based telephoto lens, going to be great for sports and wildlife. And man, it does not disappoint, I'll tell you that much. What we're going to do today is break this thing down, of course talk about the performance, but we're also going to do some comparisons between its very kind of closely related 50-400 bigger brother here, and also the original 70-300 from Tamron, as well as requested the Sony 70-350, which is an APS-C lens, but also kind of close to this thing. And because of its size and weight and also price, this could also work really well as an APS-C lens, although it's full frame. So guys, let's jump in and talk about what's most important, and well, that's the performance of it. So let's dive in and first have a look at some of my favorite shots to date. It can produce some absolutely beautiful photos, and let's first dive into, well, the autofocus of this lens. I'm happy to say that it keeps up with just about everything very, very well, as you can see here. Now, I do kind of notice a few hiccups when it comes to closer subjects. Now, it doesn't have a focus limiting switch, so just be aware that although it probably could be fixed with an update in firmware, I do notice a little bit of kind of hesitation when things are a little bit closer, because this lens does have an incredibly, well, versatile focal length. 50 all the way out to 300, and if you do have an APS-C or if you throw it into crop mode, it's going to have a 75 to 450 equivalent. So yeah, very, very impressive when you consider the size and the weight. This thing is actually a pound less than the 50-400, obviously not getting quite as much reach, and a few more bells and whistles on this guy, but man, for the price, for performance, this thing is very, very good. In terms of aperture performance, it's not the fastest, starting at f4.5 going to 6.3 as our maximum aperture. And if you are wondering in terms of the aperture performance when it's going to change as you zoom, I'll throw that up for you here. So no deal breakers in that regard. And as far as the aperture blades, you're going to get 9, which is going to give you some beautiful autofocus backgrounds in a lot of cases. And because you can zoom all the way into 300, you can get some really nice compression. And one of the things that really sets this lens apart isn't just its focal length, which is incredibly versatile, 50 all the way to 300, but it's also Tamron's amazing engineering when it comes to the minimum focus distance, and you get a half macro capability at 50 millimeters with this thing. So you can really get up close and personal with anything you're shooting. It does a pretty darn good job as well when you're zoomed all the way out. You're still going to be able to get quite close at about 35.4 inches on the telephoto side. And if you're wondering exactly what the minimum focus distance is when you're at 50, it's going to be about 8.7 inches. So performance-wise, there's not a lot of bad things to say about it at all. It does have their fastest VXD focusing motors that you'll find in the 50-400 as well, meaning lightning fast response. And as you saw, is no slouch when it comes to accuracy. By the way, if you have been struggling with your photography edits lately, my preset master pack is now available. This is going to easily take your baseline edits to the next level and give you some creative options with one single click. Buy once and you'll get lifetime updates, and I'm also including you in a monthly draw to win things like lenses and all sorts of gear. Here's a few examples for you, link in the description. Now, it does have a manual focus ring at the back here. It turns very, very lightly and easily, but honestly, you're probably not going to be using that too much. Although if you plan on it, the focus experience in that regard is just fine. I'm also happy to report that this lens does control focus breathing very, very well. It's almost non-existent. So if you are somebody that likes to shoot some video, just know that this is going to be a great performer in that regard. Also worth mentioning, this is of course image stabilized, and it does perform very, very well. There is no buttons or switches other than one customizable focus hold button here that we'll talk about in a second. But in terms of the performance of the image stabilization built in, it's very, very impressive. I'd say even a little bit better in my experience than the 50-400. Now we're going to dive in a second and check out the sharpness of this lens and even compare it to the 50-400, but I did want to touch on just a few of the other lenses as requested. So the original Tamron 70-300 isn't quite going to be comparable to this lens. This is kind of the new generation and a big step over that lens. Although that thing can be found for an incredible price, making it a great lightweight budget option, this thing just, in my opinion, has a lot more going for it, from that more versatility to the macro-like capabilities, and the autofocus and just about everything else is going to be a lot better. So if you are considering the two, just know that this is just a step above. Now, in terms of the Sony 70-350, that thing is awesome, and it does have a few more of the bells and whistles, and it can take advantage of some of the faster shooting speeds on some cameras where Tamron lenses are going to be capped at 15 frames per second. If that's not a factor, then, well, this might be a great pickup, especially if you're considering maybe upgrading to full frame in the future. That said, let's dive in and check out the sharpness of this lens. And here's a look at the sharpness and optics of the 50-300. We're going to start at 50mm wide open at f4.5. As we can see in the center, it's great sharpness as you'd expect, and getting into the corners, about halfway through it starts to degrade a little bit, and unfortunately when we get to the extreme corners, it's really not that impressive at all. Not a very good performance. Stopping down here to f5.6.3, we see maybe a tiny improvement, but definitely nothing to write home about. Down to f8 here, we can still see it struggling quite a bit, but it is catching up. Down to f11 now, and it's finally starting to look decent. Now, again, down to f16, looking pretty good. And now we can stop all the way down to f22 for a reasonably sharp image across the frame. Overall contrast is decent, colors are vibrant. And let's check out the middle of our focal range. Here we are at about 200mm now. Our maximum aperture is f6.3. The center of the image nice and sharp as expected. And as we get into the corners, we see a much better performance. Even into the extreme corners, it's looking actually pretty darn good now. This is wide open, of course, at f6.3. As we stop down to f8, we see some brightening up and definitely some more detail revealed. Stopping down here to f11, looking really good, and then further down to f16 where it starts to degrade, and then down to f22, and we're still going to be able to stop down all the way down to f32 now, which is definitely going to be a little bit hazy, a bit of diffraction kicking in, but still, for the most part, a completely usable image. And here we are at 300mm zoomed all the way out. The center of the image is actually nice and sharp here. f6.3 is our maximum aperture. As we get into the corners, it looks like a pretty decent performance actually. The very corners are actually pretty darn good. Rather impressive. Stopping down to f8 here, we can see a little bit of an improvement, and down further to f11, still looking good. f16 here, we'll start in with a little bit of degradation, and all the way down here to f22, still usable completely, and we can actually still stop down further down to that f32, where it does definitely start to degrade a little bit more. In terms of sharpness overall, if you can get past the corner sharpness at 50mm, it's actually a pretty good performer. Having a quick look at the distortion and vignetting, we can see here at 50mm it's actually quite well controlled, and if we stop down we can just see a tiny bit of vignetting disappear, and this is at 50mm. Having a look at around 200, we can definitely see some pincushion distortion happening, and once again if we do stop down we see it brighten up quite a bit with that vignetting disappearing a little bit. And all the way out to a maximum 300, we can definitely see some of that distortion continue. Not super bad though, I've definitely seen worse. And once again, if we stop down a little bit down to f8, we can see that that vignetting does improve. So overall for distortion and vignetting, the distortion is decently controlled, no deal breakers there. And the vignetting is a little bit heavy wide open, so make sure you hit that profile correction to correct that right up. Okay guys, so here's the sharpness comparison between the 50-300 here and the longer reaching and more expensive 50-400. This kind of surprised me a little bit. This is at 50mm wide open, both at f6.3. If we look in the center, they're pretty darn close. Very, very comparable, really kind of have to split hairs, but once we start to get up a little bit into maybe about halfway into the corner, you can see that the 50-400 takes the clear edge, and up into the corners we can see just an incredible performance out of the 50-400, where the 50-300 does struggle a little bit. So at 50mm, definitely the winner is going to be the more expensive lens here, unsurprisingly, and less than impressive corner sharpness here for the 50-300. And here's a look at 200 millimeters, both lenses, and they're both going to have a maximum aperture now of f6.3. We're going to check out the middle, but it's worth noting that the exact same lighting conditions were used with both of these examples. So guys, in the middle, we're going to see pretty much the same thing. Really great sharpness in the middle, and as we get up into the corners, we can start to see a much better performance out of the 50-300 here. Even into the extreme corners, we can see a definite improvement here, but the clear winner still remains the 50-400. Hands down, a great performance here out of that 50-400 that's just batting out of its league, but the 50-300 at 200 millimeters is definitely no slouch either. And here we are at maximum reach with both lenses, 300 on the 50-300 and 400 with the 50-400, both at a maximum of f6.3. The center of the image, pretty darn good in both cases. You can see here that the slight edge definitely goes to the 50-300 here. As we get into the about halfway mark, you can see that still the 50-300 outperforms the 50-400. And finally, into the very edges, we can see that the clear winner in this case is the 50-300. This surprised me a lot, and as you zoom out, you can see that, yeah, we're definitely pixel peeping and splitting hairs, but if we were really looking for that corner detail and sharpness, the edge is going to go to the 50-300, being a less expensive lens. So this really surprised me. They're both great performers optically, but when it comes to telephotos, well, we really want to have really good quality out at the maximum reach. So in this regard, it does a pretty darn good job. Here's a few more photo examples as I tell you about my two favorite things about this lens. One has got to be the size and the versatility. They've found an amazing balance between performance and size, and this lens is fantastic when it comes to carrying it for long periods because it's so lightweight. I'm not a big fan of swapping lenses all the time, so the close minimum focus distance is an absolute dream of mine. With half macro, they absolutely nailed it and made this thing just so incredibly versatile and fun to use. Being able to get so many uses out of a bigger telephoto lens is just fantastic for me. Next, let's have a look at the actual physical characteristics of this lens. Now, it's going to have the exact same standard and quality that we expect out of pretty much every other Tamron lens these days, and it's quite comparable to the 50-400, just lighter, just less expensive, and just less bells and whistles like I mentioned. The only thing that you're gonna find on this guy is just one manual focus hold button here that is customizable, and we've got a little lock switch over here. So I found that I don't know if we really need that because it does actually not creep at all when you're moving. It's very well controlled, but you do have that if you want. And the customizable focus hold button, you can customize in their lens utility software, allowing you to change things like manual focus, or if you're shooting video, you can rack focus. It's got a few cool different options that you can kind of play around with. But it's bare bones, there's no manual focus switch or anything like that to keep the cost down, and it is considerably less, and I think very, very well priced compared to something like the 50-400 here. We're going to get into more of the value here in a bit, but again, the quality, the feel of it, the balance is very, very good. It's very lightweight, weighing a pound less than the 50-400. So if you are somebody who's traveling or just wants a more lightweight option, this thing is fantastic. It does have the common and consistent Tamron 67mm filter threads and their patented coatings to help with ghosting and flare on the front. On the back, of course, a nice metal mount with a little rubber gasket for confidence when it comes to weather sealing, and this is dust and moisture resistant. Not waterproof like pretty much any lens out there, so do keep that in mind, but I think it's gonna stand up to pretty much anything you throw at it in terms of wildlife and sports out in a little bit of rain. I think you're gonna be just fine. Now it does of course extend as you zoom a bit, and it is about 1.5 inches less than the 50-400. Nothing too crazy, and it does kind of, as you can see, kind of pack up really nicely for travel, so you can even throw it in your small bag, and in my case, fits nicely in my little 10-liter backpack. Overall, for build and features, the build is good. The features are a little bit lacking, but that's pretty fine in my opinion for what it is. Keeps the cost down, I'm happy with that. So as promised, I wanted to touch on the value of this lens, and at $799 US, I think it's an absolute steal. The bigger 50-400 comes in at $1299, which is considerably more. Again, I would just kind of think of this as a little bit not quite as good performing, but definitely more lightweight and cost-effective version of this lens. Overall, I think the performance out of this thing is going to be a little bit better, and rightfully so. It's more expensive and it's got a few more bells and whistles. So overall, I think the value here though, compared to some of the other stuff on the market, which is quite limited when you consider what this thing can actually do, I think is absolutely fantastic. And honestly, I give it 5 stars for value. So there you have it, guys. There's my thoughts on the amazing Tamron 50-300. It's got the size, it's got the weight, it's got the budget, it's got the performance, it's got pretty much everything going for it. This thing is just another huge win from Tamron. And again, I didn't mention, but of course it has that awesome Tamron long warranty, which gives you peace of mind. So 100% recommended to you guys. I would fully recommend this. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you drop them down below. I hope this video helped, and if it did, hit that like and subscribe button, join the community, and like always, make mistakes, be yourself, and get out there and take some more pictures. See you next time.